Welcome to another edition of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to start talking about cell growth, division, and reproduction. So for this first video we're going to break things into two sections. We're going to go through and look at the beginning part of the information in your note packet, and then we're going to continue on and talk about the cell cycle and the actual process of cell division. But for right now, let's talk about the fact that living things will actually grow by producing more cells. And now that makes sense to most of you. When you think about us, how is it that we've gotten bigger as we've been alive? Well, we've gotten bigger because we've produced more cells. We have more cells today than we did the day we were born. Well, what about a unicellular organism? A unicellular organism, well, they don't really produce more cells because they are only one cell. So those cells need to get bigger. So the problem becomes when a cell increases in size, the cell's surface area does not increase as fast as the volume increases. What do we mean by that? If you think about a circle, like a cell, when that gets larger, the surface area is the distance around the outside. The volume is what's on the inside. So as that cell is getting bigger, the volume on the inside is getting larger, but the volume inside is larger than the surface area outside. Well, so what? Why would the cell care about that? Well, think about it this way for a minute. If you need to get things in and out of the cell, so you need to undergo transport, you need to absorb some things into the cell, move them around inside. If your cell membrane is only that big, but you've got to move stuff all around inside that cell versus a cell membrane that's this big, and now you only have to move things around inside that smaller cell, which one is easier? Of course, the smaller one is easier. So this idea of cell division and why do cells divide become very important for how cells are going to be able to keep up with their metabolic needs, with the needs they have to sustain life. So before it becomes too large, a growing cell will divide to form two daughter cells. So when we talk about a cell actually dividing, that process where they split themselves in half, we're forming daughter cells. The process a cell uses to produce daughter cells is called cell division. So the cell is dividing. Sometimes you'll hear them say the cell is replicating, meaning that it's splitting itself in two. Before cell division, the DNA is copied, so each new cell will have all of the information. And think about it, if you divide the cell, what happens to the volume for each new cell? Well, the volume has also been reduced. So that issue of cell size, if it grows too big, it can't sustain itself. When you cut it in half, now you've cut the size down, the volume is less, so the surface to volume ratio is better. Now your cell has an easier time supporting itself. So we need to look at reproduction, and we need to make sure we have a definition for reproduction. The formation of new individuals is the definition. One of the most important characteristics of living things is the fact that they can reproduce. We talked way back in the beginning of the year about life functions, and remember we talked about life function of reproduction. Okay, well, if we talk about reproduction for a minute, do I as an individual within the species have to reproduce to live? No. That was the one life function that an individual could do without. However, if I want to continue my species, do I need to reproduce? And the answer there is yes, because if we don't produce new individuals, the species eventually would die off. So there's two different types of reproduction. The first one is asexual reproduction. It's the production of genetically identical offspring by one single parent. It can be relatively simple, efficient, and effective. Asexual reproduction allows populations to increase in number very, very quickly. The best example here are bacteria. We know that within a relatively short amount of time, 12 to 24 hours, you can go from a few to millions of bacteria. That's because they're reproducing asexually. You have one cell that is dividing, and then they divide, and they divide, and they divide, and they divide, and they divide. So again, what's happening is we have identical offspring. The important thing for you to remember there is that they are identical. So what's the other type of reproduction? The one we're probably more familiar with because it applies to us and other animals, sexual reproduction, is the production of offspring that inherit some genetic information from each parent. So there was a contribution from your mom with the egg, there was a contribution from your dad with the sperm. So it tells you offspring are produced by the fusion, what does fusion mean? Coming together of special reproductive cells. And what are those reproductive cells? In the female it's the egg cell, and in the male it's the sperm cell. So when those two cells come together, they both have genetic information in their nuclei that when they fuse, when they come together, that information now makes up the new individual, like you, for example. So each type of reproduction has advantages and disadvantages. So we could go through and list the advantages and disadvantages for both. Species survive by reproducing. And we said that a minute ago. It's important to the survival of the species for reproduction to take place. The better suited that a species is, or that an organism is to its environment, obviously it's going to survive and pass on its information. So let's start looking at the process of cell division. First, we need to talk about the genetic information. The genetic information is bundled into packages of DNA known as chromosomes. We just finished in the last unit talking about DNA. So we know what DNA is. We know that DNA is what stores or what has the blueprint, the instructions. That's what has our genetic information. Well, that DNA is neatly packaged, neatly kind of wound up, if you will, inside structures called chromosomes. So where are those chromosomes found, or what do those chromosomes look like? And we've got two different options. We have prokaryotic cells. Remember, these are the guys that don't have a nuclear membrane. This would be like bacteria. So that chromosome is just kind of in the middle of the cell, hanging out, no membrane around it. So prokaryotic chromosomes are single circular chromosomes that hold most of the organism's DNA. And then we have eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells like us. And remember, with a eukaryotic cell, I do have a membrane-bound nucleus, I do have my cell membrane, and then the chromosomes are found inside of that nucleus, and the DNA is in the chromosomes. So with eukaryotic chromosomes, there's much more DNA in eukaryotic cells, so they contain multiple chromosomes. We have a lot more DNA than bacteria do. That should make sense. We're far more complex. So because of that, we have more DNA. If we have more DNA, then it's packaged up into more chromosomes than what a prokaryotic cell would have. So how do we package all of this information? Well, there's something called chromatin. Chromatin is where a chromosome protein complex is formed inside the nucleus. The chromosome forms a close association with a protein known as a histone. And in your note packet, I did not try to draw it here, but what it shows you is if we pull one of these chromosomes out of the nucleus and you blow up the chromosome, you're going to find these proteins that double helix DNA is wrapped around. Those proteins are called histones. And when you wrap up all of that DNA around the proteins and around itself, and it just keeps wrapping, that gives us chromosomes. And what eventually happens inside the nucleus is all of those chromosomes get tangled up and wrapped together to form what almost looks like one long strand or one long string of DNA, and that is chromatin. So one thing that I want to look at quickly before we move too much further into talking about replication of cells and DNA is we need to look at chromosomes for a minute a little closer. And we need to look at them in eukaryotic cells. We have two different options for chromosomes. You can have single-stranded chromosomes. You can see that there's only one with a structure in the middle. Or we can have double-stranded chromosomes. So you can see that there's two sides, again with the structure in the middle. And what is that structure in the middle referred to as? It is a centromere. 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 Okay? It's the structure that's in the middle of the chromosomes. So how would I go from a single-stranded chromosome to a double-stranded chromosome? And hopefully what you're thinking there is that the DNA replicated. The DNA underwent division. So what happens? I go from one strand, single strand, to two strands. And what can you tell me about those two strands? They are exactly the same as each other and that strand that we started with. So when we do that, we end up with a whole new strand that's an identical copy. So I go from single-stranded chromosomes to double-stranded chromosomes. That takes us through part 1 of cell growth, division, and reproduction. In the next video, we're actually going to look at the cell cycle and how cells divide. What is the process that they actually undergo, and how do they do it?